Right, so I'm going to be taking you through a few ideas today. There's not going to be time for us to give a full exploration of every topic related to cybersecurity, but hopefully we'll give you a few ideas and a few things to think about. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to get straight into it. Now, when we talk to people about cybersecurity, people want to ask a few different questions. People want to know how big is the threat? What is the scale of the problem that we might be facing? What kind of investment do we need to make to kind of address that threat and address these problems? What are my risk and exposure areas? Where am I best off focusing that investment to make sure that it has the biggest impact? There are a few other comments that crop up as well. Some people will maybe think to themselves that it's not going to happen to me. I'm not a big enough target to really be a concern here. I've already got something covered like antivirus, so I've ticked those boxes, I'm fine. So I think when we look at these things, I can kind of understand where people are coming from when they're thinking that they're kind of sorted or that they're not a big enough target. Because, of course, a lot of the time when we hear about cybersecurity, we're hearing about it in headlines. We're hearing about it in the news. It's not just events like this where we're pushing out a cybersecurity message. You might see this cropping up in news headlines. We have various cybersecurity incidents that we see on a fairly regular basis. Things like global ransomware attacks. We've got the screen on the right-hand side here of the WannaCry ransomware that hit a number of organizations last year. High-profile data breaches affecting a range of different organizations. It seems to be on a fairly regular basis now that we see headlines in the news of another organization having a data breach, having a leak, being hit in some fashion. Denial of service attacks. This is still kind of the bread and butter for some hackers out there that they're just seeking to take things down just because they can. Maybe these are people that are honing their skills that we might need to be concerned about at some point in the future. Email-based social engineering, phishing attacks, people trying to impersonate executives within your organization, trying to impersonate your customers, your partners, the financial institutions that you interact with. And again, these people are trying to extract money from us, and a variety of others. There's not time to go through every single topic today, but these are just some of the things that we might see cropping up in the news headlines. But between the headlines, what does normal look like? What's the normal state of play between these kind of headline events occurring? Well, no news is not necessarily good news. Attacks are going on all the time. The backdrop to this slide, I don't know how well you can see this here, but it's a screenshot of a live cybersecurity attack map. You can go to Google and search for these live cyber attack maps, and you'll get a map of the world, and they will give you a geographic visualization of all of the attacks that are going on. And there is no time that you can go to any of these websites and see nothing happening. It's constant. It's going on all of the time. You see these attacks flying around, hitting various countries, hitting various locations. It's constant and ongoing. And this will just be a snapshot. This will just be what that particular security monitoring organization can see with their systems. There's a whole hell of a lot more that's going on all of the time. Attackers will go after everyone. We're not just looking at this and saying, well, how big of a target we are. To an attacker, to a hacker, you could just be another IP address on the internet. They're not necessarily seeing what's behind that until they've got behind that, and they can see what kind of organization you are and what kind of IT resources you have. So anybody can be a target here. And many attacks are automated and opportunistic. We see things like ransomware, for example. These are things that are just being released on the internet with a view to spreading like a virus. If someone sneezes in your general direction, there's a good chance that you're going to get a cold. And it's not because the cold wants you to be infected, it's just an opportunistic thing that's occurred. So just remember the fact that somebody could just click on a link, they could open a dodgy attachment, and that could be you potentially suffering from a problem there. The invasion of a network, so when we start talking about those larger organizations with a larger network, the invasion of a network can sometimes go unnoticed for long periods of time. If an attacker is getting into your systems and they realize that there are some resources there that they can potentially take advantage of there, it behooves them to try and stay as unnoticed as possible. Indeed, in many larger organizations, people are now taking the attitude of assuming breach. The sort of cybersecurity approach is to assume breach rather than saying, right, we're starting from a blank sheet. How do we keep that clean? They're starting from the position of saying, let's assume that somewhere somebody could be in the network. How do we contain that? How do we keep things isolated? But let's talk about a few of the risk areas that we might need to be concerned about. Now, I apologize if this is covering off a few areas that you might already be aware of. We do have some basic areas to think about. Our internet connection, of course. This is connecting us to this big wide world. The PCs and devices that we have. And of course, these days, that's not just PCs and laptops. That's going to be smartphones, tablets, and a whole range of other devices that we might need to think about. Operating systems and software, because we start talking about patch management, keeping these things up to date. Data and email. Your data is, of course, the crown jewels. It's no surprise that when we think about things like ransomware, they're trying to deny you access to your own data, which is effectively going to prevent you from doing your job. Network and wireless, your wired network, your wireless network, making sure that these areas are secure. But it's not just the technology that we need to think about, it's the overall approach that we're using within the business. So people, are we investing in cyber security awareness training to make sure that our staff know how to respond? If we've invested in good technology, there's always the possibility that things could slip through the cracks. The policies that we have for IT usage, our password policies, making sure that we have strong password policies in place, maybe using multi-factor authentication, thinking about device access, who has access to the devices, our data storage, how secure is that, and data sharing, who are we sharing data with and in what ways. Now, there's a number of different approaches that we might need to take to build up a kind of ring of security around our environment, and there's a few here that I'm sure many of you will already be aware of, things like firewalls, anti-malware, good patch management, having a generally good, secure lockdown configuration, and employing good user training, as I say there. But always remember that there's always the possibility that there could be some loopholes here. So taking an approach here that is mindful of the fact that maybe someone could stroll in, plug something into our network, and bypass some of our security systems. So how do we address some of these things? Well, it's important to take a kind of a risk assessment approach, thinking about risk assessment for your IT. You know, who can gain access to your systems? What can they gain access to? Where? When? Why? When we think about the risk assessment approach, there's a number of different things that we can factor in there, and then start defining appropriate controls to look after the cybersecurity of our systems and designing good protection in there. It's important to review this on a regular basis. Cybersecurity is never really done or finished. The threats that we have to think about, it's a moving target. These are things that are evolving all the time. We've got people out there that are actively trying to bypass the security that we might put in place. So we've got to be mindful of the fact that we need to keep up to date with that. And then document this. So when we're thinking about our cybersecurity approach, think about having a cybersecurity response plan for what you might do in the event that a breach did occur. How do you respond to that? Do you have systems in place to respond? Just like having a disaster recovery plan, you might have a cybersecurity recovery plan in place. And again, thinking about the risk assessment side of this, if you think about that sort of classic risk assessment approach of, you know, likelihood of occurrence versus impact, you think about a fire, for example. Well, a fire has a high impact, but barring arson, a fire doesn't want to happen. Whereas you've got a whole range of different attackers out there that are actively trying to get into people's networks. There's motivation, there's will behind that. People are trying to get into your system. So I would argue that maybe the likelihood of occurrence there is a little bit higher. And the impact of that could be almost as high, if not as high, as a disaster. If it knocks your systems off completely, it's the same as just being down, a business down situation. So having a good cyber response plan can be very helpful. Now, I'm going to go through one or two different ideas here, just a few different concepts, just to have a few different thoughts. Again, not going to be able to cover off everything here today, but hopefully just to give you a few things to think about. Email security. Now, when most of us think about email security, we primarily think about having email filtering of some kind, looking after our email so that we have a clean, hygienic feed of email coming in that's free of spam and viruses and hopefully phishing. But in this context, I'm more sort of interested in email that we're sending out. And again, just to dovetail with the previous speaker there about data protection, thinking about the information that we're sending out, thinking about what our email potentially says about us to anybody that might be looking at that email in the middle. I liken email to a postcard. There's not really much in the way of security. Email hasn't really changed over the years to build in any kind of additional protections that is going to guarantee to us that nobody else can read our email. And to make matters worse, we will of course put attachments onto these emails. additional information or additional documentation that somebody could intercept. And there's no real guarantee that somebody in the middle can't intercept that email and gain a copy of the data. And neither you as the sender nor the recipient is going to know that that's occurred. You've sent the email on its merry way, the recipient's received it, everything. Hacker might use this to gain access to confidential information. They might build up a profile of your business processes that they could then potentially take advantage of. So there are any number of reasons why we might want to secure this process and try and make it a little bit more robust. We might, for example, want to move to a situation where our attachments aren't actually going with our email, but they're being sent via a secure server, so that when we send the email, it's uploaded to a server via an encrypted connection, and then the recipient can simply click to download that attachment again via an encrypted connection. So this starts to help us improve the process. And it's not just about improving security for us, it's also about our interactions with our customers and our partners and our suppliers. If I'm seeing somebody that is doing this kind of thing, potentially taking my security seriously, I can see that as a visible thing. This is helping us from a reputational perspective. Another area that obviously is on everybody's mind still is ransomware. This problem isn't really going to go away. I don't think that's going to be happening anytime soon. This quote was one that I found that was around from some researchers at Cisco's security labs. We cannot say it loud and often enough. Ransomware has become the black plague of the internet, spread by highly sophisticated exploit kits and countless spam campaigns. So again, you have things like the WannaCry ransomware. This hit a number of organizations last year. This was part of a very high-profile attack, given the places that it affected. Things like the NHS, for example, got hit. The thing that's most insidious about these kind of ransomware infections is the scope that these things can gain very, very quickly. They don't necessarily have to infect every machine and every server in your environment to do a huge amount of damage. It could just be as simple as one machine that gets brought into the environment that is in some way compromised. And these things are then going to start scanning for the file servers and file shares that are running in your environments. They don't need to infect those systems, but if they can access the folders that are being shared there, they can encrypt them. They can then secure that using an encryption method, and then you're going to see that you can't access your data, and you're then going to start seeing this screen. This screen might only pop up on that one infected machine. Everybody else is, raising tickets with the IT help desk saying, I can't access my files, we can't work. In the meantime, you've got one person saying, oh, I think my PC has been infected. Actually, no, it's the whole network that's been affected here, but it might only have been one PC that necessarily has been infected with the ransomware. And again, there are ways and means that we can secure ourselves here, because we need to do this. Criminals are making off with our money. We would never recommend that anybody pay the ransom. In majority of cases, it's not necessarily going to get you the results that you are hoping for, and it could potentially mark you out as a target. If you're paying the ransom, a criminal is going to be thinking to themselves, these guys haven't been able to get around it, they've not had a good backup, they've not had good protection, they're having to pay. Let's see if we can reinfect them. You might not have been explicitly targeted in that first infection, but if you pay the ransom, well, then the targeted attacks might start heading your way. They're going to try and get those targeted attacks towards you before you can close the barn door. So we would never recommend that anybody pay the ransom. But there are things that we can do. Make sure that we've got good backup. Obviously, we want to be able to restore our data should we get hit with ransomware. We want to make sure that we've got good protections. And it's not just about antivirus. Security solutions should be able to monitor your file shares and folders, looking for that dodgy activity, connections from a machine that might be on a network trying to encrypt our data, and prevent that encryption from taking place. Close down that connection so that the damage can't be done in the first place. If possible, prevention is always going to be better than cure. Finally, another area that I'm going to touch on is mobile security. And this, again, is starting to dovetail between security and data compliance. We've got to think about the fact that even if we're not necessarily supplying corporate mobile phones to our staff, people might be using their own smartphones, trying to gain access and do a little bit of work. They want to maybe get to email, things like that. But that potentially opens them up to a whole range of different possibilities with what they can do with that data. taking an attachment on a file and thinking, oh, hey, I've got this file here, this is quite important, I'm going to save it to my Dropbox so I can work on that on my home PC later. This sort of shadow IT that starts to emerge. People could forward these emails to somebody. If that's confidential information, you might not necessarily want that to occur. Even something as simple as screenshotting or copying and pasting data, if it's particularly sensitive information, you might not want that to happen. So enter the rise of things like mobility management solutions. Enterprise mobility management is going to help us prevent people from hitting the share button and pushing that into another application that's installed on the device. It might even allow us to prevent the forwarding of a confidential email. It'll even allow you to set policies that say we want to prevent screenshots or even prevent copying and pasting. So you can decide these policies for yourself depending on the sensitivity of the data that you're handling, and allow you to block these things out if needs be. At the same time, these solutions can also provide secure ways for people to carry on having access to the data. You know, it's convenient. It's nice to be able to have access to this data on smartphones, anywhere we go, work from home, work mobile. If we start locking these things down, we're kind of taking away the productivity that people are wanting to engage in. So these solutions will also allow you to provide secure means to access the data without losing control, without it floating away into consumer storage areas. We can continue to provide these capabilities. And these things evolve on so that we can even deliver this level of management across a range of different platforms. It's not just iPhones and Android devices. It could be Chromebooks, Windows PCs, Apple Macs. There's a whole range of different ways that we can use these platforms now to deliver things like data leakage prevention, so that we can maintain security of data regardless of where people are accessing it from and what device they're using. A few final thoughts that I'm going to quickly cover off, again, conscious of time here. Do take action to protect yourself. There's a whole range of different things that can be done, as we've seen today. When it comes to covering the basics, if you're not sure where to start, think about taking a Cyber Essentials audit. This is a government standard. You can be audited against this. This applies to any size of business, but small businesses as well can find this a good one to start with. It provides you a good standard that you can measure up against. And if you pass, whether it be straight away or following any remedial actions that you take, you can then display that logo, the Cyber Essentials tick, to show that you've done that you've passed that test, that you're taking cybersecurity seriously, and that can be a very good thing to display. Just like disaster recovery, have a security recovery plan. So as mentioned earlier, have a good cyber security response plan so that if the worst does happen, you know what to do, you know the actions to take, you know how to respond. And it is, again, about security and training together. So think about cybersecurity awareness training. And this isn't just with staff, this can be at every level. I think Kaspersky are here today doing their security awareness training for executives. Great strategy event to play. It's going to test your strategic thinking, so definitely go for that. And finally, a security tip, Windows 10. Well, operating systems in general, really, keeping things up to date, whether it be on the desktop or the server. A lot of people will say to me, okay, so why should I upgrade to the latest version of Windows? What are the new features? Well, for me, it's not necessarily about the surface features you can see. It's the changes that are being made to the operating system under the hood. And one of those key areas is with security. There are new features. There are things like Windows Information Protection, again, giving you things like data leakage prevention, if that's something that you need to employ. And again, those management platforms that we mentioned previously can be used to enable those kind of technologies. But a lot of the progressions in operating systems, those things that are happening under the hood to mitigate security vulnerabilities and problems are things that you're going to want to take advantage of. And one last point is if you are hit with any kind of cybersecurity incident, do look at reporting that. There's the Action Fraud website. This is part of the police. It's not an emergency service, as they point out there on their website, but it is a way of reporting to the authorities that you've had a problem. And this is going into those statistics. This is going into that thing that government sees, that they're able to review that information. If necessary, you can use this as a way of engaging the authorities if you need assistance. But you can at the very least report these things to make sure that they're aware of that. That brings me to the end of my piece. I think